The grand courtroom was a testament to tradition, a vast hall lined with towering columns of carved mahogany and adorned with the quiet solemnity of justice. Sunlight streamed in through the stained glass windows, casting fractured patterns of blue and gold onto the polished floors. The air carried the scent of old leather, aged paper, and a faint trace of cologne from the attorneys seated at the long oak tables. Pam Bondi stood poised at the plaintiff's table, her presence striking against the backdrop of legal antiquity. She was no stranger to high-profile cases, nor to the weight of public scrutiny. Her golden hair, always immaculate, framed a face that had weathered countless media storms with unwavering resolve. Dressed in a tailored navy suit, she exuded the same controlled power she had become known for, graceful but firm. This case was different. It wasn't just about legal technicalities or navigating the intricate web of statutes and precedents. It was personal. Across the room, seated on the raised bench, was Judge Marcus Ellerby, a man whose reputation preceded him like an ill-fated omen. For years, whispers had circled in the legal corridors, stories of favors exchanged behind closed doors, of rulings that bore the unmistakable fingerprints of influence. Yet, he sat there in his robes of authority, a mask of civility barely concealing the arrogance that lurked beneath. He despised her. That much had been clear from the moment she had walked into his courtroom, from the way his cold eyes had scrutinized her as if she were an unworthy interloper in his domain. Perhaps it was her past, a prosecutor who had taken on corruption cases with relentless tenacity. Or maybe it was something more insidious, a disdain for the strength she carried in a field where power had long been reserved for men of his ilk. She had felt his contempt the moment she began her opening argument, his interruptions laced with thinly veiled condescension. "Ms. Bondi, I trust you are aware that theatrics hold no place in this courtroom," he had remarked earlier, his tone sharp with manufactured patience. Pam had merely straightened her shoulders, refusing to bite at the bait, continuing her case with measured precision. But now, as she stood before the jury, presenting her argument with clarity and conviction, she could sense him growing restless. His gavel tapped against the bench, once, twice, an impatient rhythm designed to unsettle her. And then he did it, the moment that would shift the course of everything. He leaned forward slightly, his smirk barely concealed. "Perhaps, Ms. Bondi, if you spent more time understanding the law rather than parading on television, you would recognize the flaw in your argument." A murmur rippled through the room, sharp inhales and exchanged glances filling the space between the echo of his words. Even the opposing counsel, though adversarial, flicked a glance toward her with something that looked like mild surprise. Pam felt the weight of the insult settle in her chest, its sting undeniable. The courtroom had always been a battlefield, but this was an ambush. Not just an attack on her credibility, but a deliberate, public attempt to humiliate her. A lesser attorney might have let the heat of emotion dictate their next move, might have allowed their voice to rise or their composure to fracture. But Pam Bondi was not a woman easily unraveled. Slowly, deliberately, she turned her gaze toward the judge, meeting his eyes with an unshakable steadiness. She would not respond with anger. She would not grant him the satisfaction of seeing her flinch. Instead, she let the silence stretch, let the weight of his own words linger in the charged air of the courtroom. And then, in that silence, something shifted. Not her, but in him. There was a flicker of something in Judge Ellerby's expression, something almost imperceptible, but there nonetheless. A moment of realization that he had overstepped, that he had played his hand too boldly. But the damage was done. Pam turned back toward the jury, her voice measured, controlled. "Your Honor," she said, her words carrying no hint of the slight he had thrown her way, "I would ask that we remain focused on the facts of this case, rather than personal commentary." The formality of her response, the sheer restraint in her tone, only served to magnify the judge's indiscretion. The jury, the spectators, even the court reporter, each one of them had witnessed what had just transpired. Judge Ellerby straightened in his seat, his lips pressing into a thin line. For the first time that day, he did not interrupt her again. But as Pam continued her argument, as she methodically unraveled the case with the precision of a surgeon, she knew this wasn't over. Not yet, because what the judge didn't realize, what he would soon come to regret, was that in his arrogance, in his overconfidence, he had made a fatal mistake. He had underestimated her, and in mere minutes, the same courtroom that had been his kingdom for so long would bear witness to a reckoning he never saw coming. The energy inside the courtroom shifted, a subtle but undeniable tension creeping through the air like the first hint of an approaching storm. Though Judge Marcus Ellerby resumed his practiced air of authority, his earlier misstep had left an imprint, a crack in the polished veneer of his control. The spectators remained silent, but their glances spoke volumes. Some exchanged knowing looks, while others darted their eyes cautiously between the judge and Pam Bondi, anticipating what might come next. Pam stood at the plaintiff's table, her hands resting lightly on the polished wood as she scanned the jury with unwavering composure. There was no anger in her expression, no visible trace of the insult he had hurled at her, only the quiet certainty of a woman who had spent years weathering storms far more vicious than the one brewing before her now. She had no need for retaliation. She simply needed to let the truth do the work for her. She turned back toward the judge, her posture impeccable, the weight of her next words balanced carefully in her mind before she spoke. "Your Honor, in the interest of time, I will proceed with the next set of evidence," she stated, her voice smooth and unwavering. A slight nod from the judge, curt and mechanical, an unspoken admission that he would have no further outbursts. He knew the courtroom was watching, that he had overplayed his hand, that his condescension had not gone unnoticed. The gavel of justice, so often wielded to his advantage, now felt heavier in his grasp. Pam motioned to the bailiff, who carried a thick file of documents to the evidence table. The sound of shuffling papers filled the room as she retrieved a printed transcript, one that would soon become the turning point of the entire case. "Exhibit D," she announced, her voice carrying the kind of certainty that makes people lean in without realizing it. A sworn affidavit submitted by an independent financial auditor detailing inconsistencies in the defendant's tax records over the past 5 years. The defense counsel shifted in their seats, stiffening at the implication. Judge Ellerby, however, did not react. "Not yet," Pam continued, her voice steady, deliberate. "Furthermore, Your Honor, the following exhibits provide supporting documentation: internal communications, wire transfers, and a recorded conversation between the defendant and an undisclosed associate regarding financial misreporting." Silence stretched across the room like a taut wire, everyone waiting for the judge's response. Ellerby leaned back in his chair, his fingers laced together as he exhaled through his nose, his expression carefully measured. "Ms. Bondi," he began, his voice a shade too casual, "I certainly hope this isn't another one of your headline-grabbing theatrics, because unless you have definitive proof—" Pam, never one to let baseless insinuations linger in the air, turned the page in her file with unshakable precision before responding. "Your Honor, the evidence speaks for itself," she stated, sliding a document toward the court clerk. "But if the court requires further clarification, I would be happy to call the financial auditor for testimony." The judge's expression barely flickered, but Pam noticed the slight tightening of his jaw, the subtle shift in his posture, a flicker of hesitation that had not been there before. She had seen this before, the moment when a man accustomed to unchecked power begins to feel the walls closing in, the realization that control is slipping through his fingers like sand. He cleared his throat, shifting in his seat. "Very well, Ms. Bondi," he said at last, "proceed." A quiet ripple of movement passed through the courtroom as Pam returned to her seat. But even as the trial continued, even as she methodically laid out each piece of damning evidence, her mind remained fixed on something else. Because she knew something Judge Ellerby did not. She knew that the weight of the documents before them was only the beginning, that the true reckoning was yet to come. She had spent months preparing for this case, poring over every detail, ensuring that no stone had been left unturned. But in the process, she had uncovered something even more damning than financial fraud. Judge Marcus Ellerby, the man presiding over this case with an air of unshakable authority, had skeletons of his own. And very soon, in this very courtroom, they would be dragged into the light for all to see. The steady rhythm of legal procedure continued, the courtroom settling into the routine of evidence presentation and cross-examinations, but an undercurrent of unease had begun to weave itself into the air. Judge Marcus Ellerby sat with his usual commanding presence, but those who watched closely could see the slightest tension in the way his fingers tapped against the bench, a rhythm of irritation, impatience, or perhaps something far deeper. Pam Bondi remained collected, her movements deliberate as she flipped through pages of carefully compiled documentation, ensuring every fact and every accusation rested on solid ground. This was the moment she had been waiting for, the moment where the weight of truth would tip the scales against those who had long believed themselves untouchable. She could feel the shift in the room, a silent understanding creeping into the expressions of the jury members, even the spectators who had arrived expecting a battle of legal prowess, but were now witnessing something far greater. This wasn't just another courtroom dispute. This was the slow unraveling of a power structure that had stood unchallenged for far too long. Across from her, the defense team was unraveling by the minute. Their lead attorney, a man accustomed to navigating legal loopholes and stalling tactics, had begun glancing toward the judge with an expectation that had, until now, always been met with quiet reassurance. But today, no lifeline came. Ellerby sat rigid, his usual interventions noticeably absent, as though he too understood that the case had slipped beyond his ability to control. Pam rose from her seat with measured grace, her heels clicking softly against the marble floor as she stepped toward the witness stand. The courtroom stilled, anticipation tightening its grip as she turned toward the judge's bench, her eyes locking onto his with quiet certainty. "Your Honor," she began, her voice carrying the weight of something far more decisive than mere legal argument. "Before proceeding with our next witness, I would like to submit one final piece of evidence into the record." Judge Ellerby exhaled slowly, as though he had already grown weary of the game he believed she was playing, his expression one of forced indifference. "Proceed," he said, though his tone betrayed something else, something closer to reluctance. Pam reached for the thick manila folder on the evidence table, her fingers steady as she lifted it, unfastening the clasp and sliding out a set of documents that would shift the tide entirely. "The court has already reviewed extensive financial records related to the defendant, detailing instances of tax fraud and embezzlement," she continued, her voice unwavering. "However, what we have yet to examine is the broader network that enabled these crimes to persist unchecked." She paused just long enough for her words to settle, for the gravity of the moment to weigh itself against the silence. Then, with slow precision, she handed the first document to the court clerk, watching as it was distributed to the necessary parties, including the judge himself. Ellerby barely spared it a glance before setting it aside, his impatience manifesting in the tightening of his jaw, the way his hands gripped the edge of his bench as though steadying himself. Pam allowed the pause to stretch, just enough for the murmurs in the gallery to rise before she continued. "This document," she stated, her tone deliberately even, "is a record of financial transactions between the defendant and an undisclosed intermediary, a figure whose influence extends beyond this case alone." She turned back toward the judge, her gaze unreadable, though a quiet certainty rested in the way she met his stare without hesitation. "Your Honor, before I proceed further, I would like to confirm that the court is aware of the identity of this intermediary." Ellerby's fingers twitched, his carefully controlled facade momentarily cracking before he recovered, shifting in his seat with an expression of feigned disinterest. "Ms. Bondi, if you have relevant evidence, then present it," he said, though his voice had lost its previous condescending edge, replaced instead with something closer to cautious restraint. Pam nodded, as if granting him that final illusion of control before stepping forward, holding up the final document in her hand. "The intermediary in question," she said, her voice deliberately clear, is none other than Judge Marcus Ellerby himself. A collective gasp echoed through the courtroom, the weight of the revelation crashing down with the force of a sudden thunderclap. Every head turned toward the judge, expressions shifting from confusion to shock, then settling into something closer to grim realization. Ellerby's lips parted slightly, his expression momentarily blank, as though his mind had yet to catch up with the reality of what had just transpired. For the first time that day, he did not have a sharp retort, did not wield the power of his bench like a shield. Pam let the moment stretch, watching the cracks in his composure widen, watching the carefully built fortress of unchecked authority begin to crumble beneath the weight of irrefutable evidence. And then, finally, she spoke again. "Your Honor, the prosecution formally requests that you recuse yourself from this case, effective immediately." The silence that followed was unlike any other, thick with the weight of consequences of the inevitable reckoning now set in motion. Judge Ellerby, once the unshakable figure towering above the courtroom, now sat motionless, his carefully constructed world beginning to fracture around him. And for the first time in his career, he found himself on the wrong side of the law. A courtroom is supposed to be a fortress of law, a place where justice reigns above personal ambition. But at that moment, the illusion shattered. The very judge who had presided over countless cases with an air of unshakable authority now sat motionless, the weight of his own corruption pressing down upon him like a heavy stone. The gallery, once filled with the casual whispers of spectators enjoying a legal spectacle, now sat in stunned silence, the gravity of the moment suffocating any attempt at idle chatter. Pam Bondi remained still, her posture unwavering, her expression giving no indication of satisfaction or triumph, only certainty. This moment had been a long time coming, not just for her, not just for this case, but for every individual who had stood before this man believing in a system that was meant to protect them. Judge Marcus Ellerby, for all his years of wielding power without consequence, suddenly looked much smaller. His fingers twitched against the wooden armrest of his bench, a telltale sign of nerves he had never before allowed to betray him. His gaze flickered to the bailiff, then to the defense attorneys, as though searching for some avenue of escape, some lifeline that would spare him from the reality closing in around him. "Ms. Bondi," he finally said, his voice steadier than expected, though lacking its usual bite, "this is highly irregular. Are you certain you wish to pursue this course of action?" Pam inhaled slowly, allowing his words to hang in the air before responding, ensuring that the weight of them was fully felt by all in the room. "Your Honor," she said, each syllable carefully measured, "the only irregularity here is that this has remained hidden for as long as it has." She stepped forward, placing another document on the evidence table, a second report, one even more damning than the first. "This," she continued, her voice never once wavering, "is a sworn deposition from a former court clerk, detailing financial exchanges between Judge Ellerby and an undisclosed third party." A murmur swept through the gallery, hushed voices exchanging hurried whispers, the enormity of what was unfolding before them beginning to settle into their minds. Ellerby remained still, his face locked into a mask of forced indifference. But there was something in his eyes, a flicker of calculation, the recognition that the battle he had so arrogantly assumed he controlled was no longer his to command. Pam turned slightly, addressing the jury, ensuring that they understood the full gravity of the moment. The law is meant to protect, not to serve the powerful. The courtroom is a place for truth, not personal gain. And today, we rectify an injustice that has tainted this institution for far too long. She allowed the silence to return, let it stretch and settle, forcing every individual in that room to absorb the full meaning of her words. And then, as if on cue, the doors at the back of the courtroom opened. Two uniformed officers stepped inside, their presence both subtle and overwhelming in its implication. The gallery stiffened, the spectators frozen in a delicate balance between disbelief and anticipation. The officers did not speak, nor did they need to. Their presence alone was enough to signify the inevitability of what was about to unfold. Judge Ellerby exhaled slowly, his grip tightening on the wooden bench, his carefully constructed composure beginning to show its final fractures. He turned to the bailiff, to the court reporter, to the defense attorneys, but none of them spoke, none of them moved. The authority he had wielded so effortlessly for years no longer existed. Pam Bondi remained motionless, watching, waiting, allowing the final pieces to fall into place without interference. She did not need to press further. The evidence spoke for itself, and justice was now moving forward with a force that no amount of arrogance or influence could stall. Finally, the lead officer took a single step forward. "Judge Marcus Ellerby," he said, his voice firm but devoid of malice. "You are under investigation for judicial misconduct, bribery, and obstruction of justice." The gallery erupted, not in chaos, but in the kind of quiet shock that only comes when something both expected and unthinkable finally transpires. Some gasped, some leaned forward in their seats, and others merely sat in stunned stillness, bearing witness to the fall of a man who had once seemed untouchable. Ellerby did not speak. For all his years of dominance, all his sharp-tongued remarks and power-hungry tendencies, he now sat frozen in place, as though movement itself would be an admission of guilt. The officer stepped closer, the weight of duty clear in his every motion. "Please stand," he instructed. For the first time in his long career, Marcus Ellerby had no choice but to comply. Slowly, stiffly, he rose to his feet, his once imposing figure now devoid of its former authority. Pam did not look away. She had seen this moment coming long before anyone else had dared to believe it possible. And now, as it unfolded before her, she simply remained steady, allowing justice to complete its long-overdue course. As the officers moved forward, placing a firm but respectful hand on Ellerby's arm, the weight of the moment became undeniable. This was not just an arrest. This was a statement. That corruption had a cost. That power, when abused, was not infinite. That no man, not even one who had sat upon the highest bench in a room, was above the law. And as Ellerby was led away, the last remnants of his arrogance trailing behind him like the final wisps of smoke from a dying fire, Pam Bondi simply exhaled, allowing herself the smallest moment of stillness before turning back to the case that had brought them all here in the first place. Because while one battle had been won, the pursuit of justice was far from over. As the heavy courtroom doors swung shut behind the departing officers, a new kind of silence filled the vast chamber. Not one of confusion or hesitation, but the kind that follows the final stroke of a gavel, sealing an irreversible fate. The gallery remained frozen in quiet disbelief, their collective breaths held as though afraid to disrupt the gravity of what had just transpired. Pam Bondi remained at the plaintiff's table, her fingers lightly resting on the polished wood, her expression betraying neither triumph nor satisfaction. This was not a moment for celebration. This was a moment of reckoning, the kind that arrives not with applause, but with the steady weight of justice correcting what should have never been allowed to fester. Judge Marcus Ellerby, a man who had once ruled over this courtroom with unchallenged authority, had just been led away in handcuffs. The echoes of his power, his arrogance, his unchecked influence had finally collapsed beneath the truth, leaving behind nothing but the hollow remnants of a man who had believed himself untouchable. And now, in his absence, the trial had to continue. Pam inhaled slowly, allowing herself only a moment to steady her thoughts before turning back toward the jury. Their eyes were still wide with shock, their expressions a mix of understanding and disbelief, as though the reality of what they had witnessed had not fully settled. She knew this moment had left an imprint, not just on them, but on everyone in the room. The law had done what so many believed it never would. It had caught one of its own. "Your Honor," the bailiff said, addressing the senior judge who had been hastily summoned to take Ellerby's place. "With your permission, we are prepared to proceed." The new judge, an older man with a measured air of quiet integrity, nodded slowly before settling into the chair that had so recently belonged to another. "Proceed, Ms. Bondi," he said, his voice carrying none of the arrogance of his predecessor, only the steady resolve of someone who understood the weight of his responsibility. Pam turned back to the witness stand, where the financial auditor, who had been prepared to give testimony long before the dramatic unraveling of the case, sat waiting. The witness shifted slightly, clearing his throat, glancing toward the empty space where Judge Ellerby had once sat, as though still processing what had just unfolded before him. "Mr. Caldwell," Pam began, her voice carrying the same calm precision she had maintained throughout the trial. "Before we continue, I would like to clarify one point for the jury." The auditor nodded, his hands folded neatly on his lap, his expression now composed. "Prior to today's proceedings, were you aware that the judicial authority overseeing this case had direct financial connections to the defendant?" A brief pause, then a firm shake of the head. "No, ma'am," Caldwell said, his voice carrying the weight of genuine disbelief. "That information was never disclosed to me." Pam gave a small nod, her gaze sweeping across the jury, ensuring that they understood what had just been confirmed. The very man meant to uphold justice had instead been playing puppet master in a system designed to serve only those who lined his pockets. The weight of that truth had already settled upon the courtroom, pressing against the walls like an invisible force, thick with the recognition that trust had been shattered, but not beyond repair. Pam continued with her questioning, guiding the testimony with the same meticulous care she had employed throughout the case. Point by point, she unraveled the defendant's schemes, using the very evidence Ellerby had tried to suppress to drive the final nails into the coffin of corruption. The defendant's attorney, once emboldened by the quiet assurances of judicial favoritism, now sat stiffly in his chair, his face a mask of quiet defeat. This trial had already been lost. The moment Ellerby had been escorted from the bench, the last safeguard of the defense had crumbled into dust. As the day wore on and the case drew closer to its inevitable conclusion, the weight of justice settled over the room like an undeniable truth. The jury had seen it all: the deception, the manipulation, the sheer audacity of those who had believed themselves above the law. And now, they were armed with something far more powerful than doubt. They had clarity. By the time the final arguments were made and the jury was dismissed to deliberate, the outcome was all but certain. The evidence had spoken. The law had prevailed. Pam stood outside the courthouse later that evening, the cool air washing over her as she closed her eyes for a brief moment, allowing herself to feel the exhaustion that had been kept at bay by sheer willpower throughout the day. The weight of victory did not feel like elation or celebration. It felt like relief, like the lifting of a burden too long carried. She knew this was not the end. Justice was not a single battle won, but a constant war against those who would seek to corrupt it. There would be more cases, more Ellerbys lurking in the shadows, waiting for their turn to wield power unchecked. But today, at least, had proven one thing beyond any doubt. Abuse of power always has consequences. The overconfident always fall, and the law, when wielded by those who refuse to be intimidated, will always find its way back to the truth.